when I'm driving up here with my daughter, Gretchen, and I sometimes change the lesson. Well, this time I did it earlier. I didn't change it until breakfast time. I had planned to do something today that I worked on quite a bit this past week and realized it's impossible to try to get done what I wanted to get done. And then I came across something else that I found equally interesting that I thought we ought to talk about that deals with the same material. Remember last week I said that most of what we looked at dealt with secular history, archaeology and secular history. And this week we'd concentrate on biblical history. This week and next week and the next week we're going to be sticking pretty close to biblical history. Now, biblical history differs from the secular history in that it has certain characteristics that are rather significant, that are different in the fact that it mentions God, where secular history doesn't do that. And we're going to be looking at some of the stuff that's in the Bible right now that deals with God. But it also deals with a material that is quite different in some ways from what we find in secular history, but we do find in literature. And one of the reasons I want to get to this particular part of the Bible is because it's such an excellent example of what really great literature this actually has, that we have in the Bible itself. By taking a look at some of the stories concerning Joseph. A lot of people are not aware of this, but we are quite familiar with the book of Genesis, but you realize that almost 20% of the book of Genesis is devoted just to Joseph, more so than to anybody else. Now, give you just a little bit of background here. Joseph we're given something about his birth, and that was all. He was born back up in Haran, but the story that gets interesting is when we deal with Joseph and his family. Here is a familiar picture. This is a picture. Now, I'll read you what the scripture has to say. I got this all in the scripture right now. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his children because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers, well, just stop at that. A long robe. I think I asked Gretchen this morning, when we talk about Joseph's coat, what do we think? A coat of what? Many colors. I told Gretchen, that I said, one of the first things I'm going to be talking about is that the expression a coat of many colors, and whose name is going to come up? Dolly Parton. Well, the Dolly Parton song is based somewhat on what we have in the Bible, and that is that we are accustomed to think of Joseph being given this garment by his father, this coat of many colors. That does not show up in the Bible that most of us use, but it does show up in the King James Version. Now, why is that so important? Because the King James Version probably still is one of the most popular things that has ever been written in that regard. I've told this story many times before, but I like thinking about it. And it was one of the first international conferences I went to. We had an international speaker from somewhere in Europe. I do not know who it was, but he said he was going to give his lecture in the international language of science. And you know what that is? Broken English. Well, it's kind of an interesting thing. You can go almost anywhere in the world, you will find people that will speak broken English, and you will understand them, and they will understand you. Partly because of the fact the King James Version of the Bible has had such an impact on literature throughout the whole world. People will read it in all different languages. I was one time told the stability that we have in the English language comes largely from the King James Version. Does anybody remember the other one I told you about? William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare helped stabilize the language to some extent. But other languages change a lot. But this coat of many colors was something that we're familiar with, but it actually talks here about a coat with long sleeves, and I think I should mention that as well. That coat of long sleeves comes up a little bit different. Why would it make a difference that it was a coat of long sleeves? Well, the idea was that if it had long sleeves, he would not have to be involved in physical labor. His brothers all had coats with short sleeves, but when you wore long sleeves, well, you were like the boss in the factory. You've got to tie a shirt. You're going to pick him out. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all the other of his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers, they hated him even the more. He said to them, "Hear this dream I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to it." I'm going to try to get closer to that thing. I hope I don't fall. Okay. Your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you going to have dominion over us?" So they hated him all the more. Then he dreamed another dream. He dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers, and he said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars." Wow, for goodness sake. The sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow down ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept saying in his mind, kept this saying in his mind. Now his brothers went to pasture with their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, Are not your brothers pasturing in the flock near Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he said to him, Here I am. So he said to him, Go now and see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word again. He sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Now here again, I think I will be mentioning this a little bit next week. Shechem is nowhere near Hebron. This is a long journey that he's going to go. Actually, what we're looking at is a little bit of two different stories being meshed together into one story. So he came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, What are you seeking? I am seeking my brothers. And he said, Tell me, I pray you, where are they pasturing the flock? And the man said, They have gone away, for I heard them say, Let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him afar off, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. Then they said one to another, Here comes this dreamer. Now let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild beast has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. This is the idea, to throw him into a pit. But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, Let us not take his life. And so Reuben said, Let's shed no blood. Now actually they're getting, this is another picture of him being thrown in there. And Reuben said to them, Shed no blood. Cast him into this pit here, and lay no hands upon him, that he might rescue him out of their hands and restore him to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, and they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and cast him into a pit. The pit was empty, and there was no water in it. But when they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels, bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to one of his brothers, What profit is it to us to slay our brother and conceal his blood? Gretchen knows just what I'm talking about. She's given me some paper from her office that they're not using, and it's high-class paper, and it's awfully hard to handle high-class paper because it's cut so well. She said, come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh, and his brothers hated him. Then the Midianite traders passed by, and they drew up. Well, let's go back and take a look at this. We're going to see some. What did I just read here? I'll get back to it. That's it. As they sat down to eat, looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites. You hear the word Ishmaelites? Now we read, then the Midianite leaders passed by, and they drew Joseph up to him and lifted him out of the pit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Now, Ishmaelites and Midianites are not the same people. What's happened to this story? Anybody want to guess? Two stories that have been meshed together. In one of the stories, they have Ishmaelites. In another story, they have Midianites. Then the Midianites passed by and they drew Joseph up. Then they took Joseph's robe and killed a goat and dipped the robe in its blood. And then there's another picture of Joseph being taken out of the pit. I did it. There it is. Then they took their soldiers and killed a goat, and they sent the long robe with sleeves and brought it to their father and said, this we have found. Now see whether it is your son's robe or not. And he recognized it and said, it is my son's robe. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob rent his garments and put sackcloth upon his loins and mourned for his son for many days. And all his sons and his daughters rose up to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted and said, no, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Now that's chapter 37. I'll read you from chapter 38, but it has absolutely nothing to do with this story. Why it was put together this way, I don't know. But the next chapter is a chapter about Judah and his daughter-in-law, Tamar. It has absolutely nothing to do with this story. But I want to point this out, that all of a sudden, in the middle of Genesis, we interrupt one story by introducing somebody important, Judah. Sometime later in the year, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about this fact that when we take a look at the 12 tribes, Judah sort of stands out in a certain way. And there's a very good question one might ask. You know what that is? Why? Why of the 12 brothers does Judah stand out different from the others? And we want to take a look at that. I might mention there are some books there's a book going around right now and a theory going around that Judah, it is one of the 12 tribes, but Judah the man was not related to the brothers as brother. What his relationship is, we don't know. They even question whether or not Judah was participating in the leaving Egypt to come to Israel. They're wondering whether Judah may have come all by himself. Now, if you wonder if I'm talking nonsense here, you want to go to the first chapter of the book of Judges, and you find out in the first chapter of the book of Judges, there's an awful great big long part of dealing with, guess what? How Judah got to Canaan. Normally, we don't talk about that very much, but apparently when the history was being written, they thought there was something special about Judah, and for this reason that one chapter, chapter 38, suddenly shows up there in the book of Genesis. Go to chapter 39, then it picks up again on Joseph. Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, and the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. So I want to stop just at this point. When we go through this story of Joseph over and over again, we see something that indicates this is real biblical history, because what keeps showing up? The Lord was with Joseph. Joseph has some rather remarkable things happen to him during his lifetime, but it's always pointed out by the historian that the Lord was with him, and he prospered because of the Lord. And his master saw the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he had done. I mentioned this to Gretchen. She didn't think it would work. Actually, when you have slides like this, there should be a speaker up there that says one thing repeatedly. And what is that? Next slide, please. I have to look for N, and my glasses don't go in. Maybe if I wear the other glasses, I'll see it. And his master saw that the Lord was with him. And he caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had, the house and the field. So there we see, it doesn't take long, and we'll find this happens in the next chapter as well. All of a sudden, Joseph prospers. Why? Because the Lord is involved. Again, we're seeing that this is very definitely what? Very definitely biblical history. This is an interesting part of the Bible. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and having him, he had no concern for anything but the food which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome and good-looking. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Lo, having me, my master has no concern about anything in this house, and he has put everything in my hand. He is no greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. Now then, can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Now, I'm just going to show you a couple of slides rather quickly. I think I've mentioned this several times in the past few years. It's difficult to find pictures that deal with any biblical story, but one that you can find many pictures of are what? Potiphar's wife chasing Joseph around. I think one time I did have one slide that had about 20 different depictions of Potiphar's wife. Here are a couple of them. I just picked out a few of them. Artists seem to want to get at this. Okay. And lo, although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her and to lie with her or be with her. And one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by the garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left the garment in her hand, and he fled out of the house. And when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us, who came to me to lie with me and cried out with a loud voice. And when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment with me and fled out of the house." What is that? Barefaced lie. That isn't what happened at all. I won't say anything more about right now. I want to talk about something else. We don't hear too much more about her other than that, well, I'll read the next verse, and that is that with that lie, she managed to have Joseph put in prison. But she isn't lost. she does show up. Does anybody remember another place where she shows up in a rather interesting fashion? In Dante's Inferno, he places Potiphar's wife in next to the last circle in hell, next to the worst sin you could possibly commit. In Dante's Inferno, Satan is in the middle of a circle, in the middle of the center of a circle. The first circle that you see outside of that circle is one of the most sinful people. Way on the outer circles are things like lust and somewhere in there stealing comes along. But in one of the circles very near the center, he puts Potiphar's wife, because Dante felt, and I think I agree with him, this is probably one of the worst sins that can be committed, the one that Potiphar's wife was involved in right then. What was that? Bearing false witness, lying about somebody to get them in trouble when you know it's a lie. And that's what she does, and she is put in the seventh circle of hell. There's another thing that's interesting about this story, in that it's not original. And it tells us a little bit about how some of this Old Testament was put together. There was, about at the time that this part of the Old Testament was written, the story of Potiphar's wife, that there was a very popular Egyptian story that had been making the rounds. There were not a lot of people that could read Egyptian, but the people that could know the story would repeat the story. It's a story of two brothers. And the similarity between the story of the two brothers and the story that we have here of Joseph and Potiphar's wife is so obviously obvious similarity that we ought to know a little bit about that story of the two brothers. So I looked it up this morning, and I found it on the internet. It's a fairly long story, but only the first part of it really is pertinent. It tells about two brothers, an older brother and his wife, who had taken his younger brother to live with them. And the younger brother stayed with them, and it was a very nice, happy sort of a situation. One day, the older brother and the younger brother go out in the field and find out that they don't have enough seed. And so the older brother sends the younger brother back to the house to get some more seed. He goes back to the house, and guess what? The older brother's wife starts to make a play for the guy. He resists it. She takes exception to that and is very unhappy about it. And so when her husband comes home, she lied to her husband and said, "You know what your brother did? He tried to make time with me this morning." The older brother waited until he could get vengeance on his younger brother. Well, it turned out he didn't actually do this. He saw his brother across a river and shouted at his brother that he was unhappy with what had happened. The younger brother protested his innocence and proved his innocence by mutilating himself in such a way that he indicated, "No, what your wife had told you was a lie." What we are told is that the younger brother then went off into the wilderness, according to the Egyptian story, was then used by some of the Egyptian gods and was taken care of. The older brother went home and he took care of his wife. He killed her. Now, what happened in the rest of the story, it was in such fine print, I didn't read it any further than that. But at any rate, let's take a look at what we have here in the Bible. Then she laid up the garment by her, then she had laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the very same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me and insulted me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left the garment with me and fled out of the house." When his master heard the words of his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. Now the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's care all of the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the doer of it. And the keeper of the prison paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made prosper. So what do we see? Again, evidence of the fact that we're dealing with Scripture, because who shows up very often in the story? The Lord. God is part of it. This happened to be a Yahweh story. So Joseph is thrown into prison. Now, we don't know how long Joseph stays in prison. We're going to try to put together some dates, because later on it becomes kind of important. I'll tell you the reason for it. Everybody knows this story. Eventually he's going to see his brother Benjamin. Was Benjamin born before Joseph left and was kidnapped, or was he born after? Because in some pictures you see Joseph being reunited with his brother, and his brother is a grown man of about 18 or 19 or 20 years old, and others he's a little boy. They don't really know how long. Joseph may actually have been in prison. So after this time, the king of Egypt and his baker offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he waited on them and continued for some time in custody. Now, I stop at this point. I want to point out something that you're going to see throughout this whole story, and that is that you go to your Bible, you'll find out you can read this whole story of Joseph in a matter of, I would say not more than a half an hour to 45 minutes. It doesn't take that long. What we have here is a very intricate plot, but it is all put together by a very masterful writer who managed to get it in a intricate plot. Another thing that we will find with parts of the story is that some of it came from one author, some of it came from another author. The thing that I find intriguing about the whole thing is that this plot is so well put together that it reads like a continuous story. One of the problems with Bible reading, and don't quote me on this, one of the problems with Bible reading in church is you only get one chapter at a time. You should have many chapters in a row and see how they all connect. And this is very, very true with the story of Joseph. You almost have to follow very carefully what is happening from one chapter to the next. But what we find that Joseph is now in prison. This is Potiphar accusing Joseph. Joseph got to know these prisoners. Then one night, then he put the captain of the guard charged Joseph with him. I don't know if I read this or not. The butler and the baker of the Pharaoh were in trouble. The captain of the guard charged Joseph with him, and he waited on them, and they continued for some time in custody. One night they both dreamed, and the butler and the baker and the king of Egypt were confined in the prison, each on his own dream, and each dream with its own meaning. And when Joseph came to them in the morning and saw them, they were troubled. So they asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in custody in the master's house, why are your faces so downcast today? And they said to him, we have dreamed dreams, and there is no one to interpret them. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, and I will pray you. Here's another picture. Here we see Joseph with the two prisoners, each with his own dream up in the picture up at the top there. So tell them to me. So the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream there was a vine before me. There was a vine before me. And on the vine there were 3 branches, and as soon as it budded and the blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes, Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, And I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and cause you to, and restore you to your office. And you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and do me the kindness, I pray you, to make mention of me to Pharaoh, so get me out of this house. For it was indeed stolen out of my hand of the Hebrews, and here I have done nothing, and they should put me in the prison. So he interprets the butler's dream, tells the butler things are going to go well with you within 3 days. That's why the 3 branches, you're going to be back being the cupbearer of the Pharaoh. But when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream, and there were 3 baskets of cakes on my head. And the uppermost basket were all sorts of bread, food for the Pharaoh. But the birds were eating out of it, out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you, and you will hang on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. And the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all of his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and the head of the chief of the baker among the servants. He restored the chief butler to his butlership, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. And yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. That last sentence is kind of interesting. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Because this is where we start to run into one of these problems. We don't know how long he forgot him. We don't know how long he forgot him. But there are a couple of things that are kind of interesting about this story. One of them is that it implies the interpretation of dreams. Now, in the earlier stories that we had, there were dreams as well. These were dreams that Joseph had himself, that he had dreams that seemed to indicate that at one time he would be in a position where his brothers and even his father and his mother would be showing some respect to him. You know, he was the youngest boy of the clan at that time. Now we get into something quite different. When we get into chapter 40 and chapter 41, we deal with something else that's very characteristic of one of the writers, namely the Eloise Writer. He's into interpreting dreams. And he interprets the dreams that we find in the Butler and Baker story. And that whole story comes almost completely out of what they call the Eloise source. There's no indication that there's anything of the Yahweh source into that. I'll talk more about that next week. But then we get to chapter 41. Now, I just mentioned, we don't know how long Joseph was in prison, but this just says 2 whole years. Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. Pharaoh, that's the king. And behold, there came out of the Nile 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they were fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows. Well, let's go to the next slide. Here's Pharaoh. Can you see the little dreams that he's had? Here's one of his dreams, and here's the other dream. And he's puzzled by these dreams. He doesn't know what these dreams may indicate. See the cows? Fat cows, 7 of them. Lean cows, 7 of them. What could that possibly mean? And he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing out of one stalk. And behold, after they sprouted, 7 ears, thin and blighted, And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And when the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump full ears, and Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled. And he sent and he called for the magicians of Egypt, and for all the wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret it to him. Then the chief butler said to Pharaoh, I remember my faults today. When Pharaoh was angry with the servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own meaning. A young Hebrew who was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard, and when he told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving us an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came to pass. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Then the Pharaoh sent and caused Joseph to be brought hastily out of the dungeon. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. That was Joseph that shaved and changed his clothes. Here's one of several pictures that I found of Joseph before Pharaoh dealing with the dream. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and there is no one that can interpret it, but I have heard it, and it is said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not me, it is God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dreams I was standing on the banks of the Nile, and 7 cows fat and sleek came up of the Nile and fed on the green grass. And 7 other cows came up, them poor and very gaunt, and then such as I had never seen in the land of Egypt. The thin and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fat cows. But when they had eaten them, and no one could know what they had eaten them, for they were as gaunt and still at the beginning. Then I awoke. I saw in the dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, and full of good, and 7 ears withered with then, and 7 ears withered thin, blighted by the east wind, and sprouted after them. And the 7 ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, and there was no one that could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dream, Pharaoh, is one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. The 7 lean and gaunt cows that come up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty years blighted by the east wind were also the 7 years of famine. And then I was told by Pharaoh, then it was, as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. And after them there will be 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten, and the land of Egypt, the famine will consume the land. And the plenty will be unknown in the hand of by reason of that famous by reason of that famine which will follow, and will be very grievous. And the doubting of the Pharaoh's dreams means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly make it come to pass. Now, therefore, Pharaoh select a man discreet and wise, and set over him the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh proceeded to appoint overseers over the land. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers of the land, and take the 5th part of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plenteous years. And let them gather up all the food of these good years that are coming, and let him lay up grain under the authority of the Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine, which are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not be perished throughout the famine. This proposal seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can't I find such a man as this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" So Pharaoh, this is another one of the. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discreet, as wise as you are. You shall be over my house and all my people, and shall order them as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to him, "Behold, I set you over all of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in the garment of the fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And then he made him to ride in his second chariot, and they cried before him, "Behold, bow thy knee." Thus he set him over the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Egypt, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man shall lift up his hand or foot in the land of Egypt." I think I have the picture there. Does anybody remember anything that I was talking about a week or so ago? One of the strange things that we have in the book of Genesis is that we find this migration of these Semites, these people that are descendants of Shem, the people later referred to as the Semitic people, living in upper Mesopotamia, and they migrate to Canaan. Guess what's going to happen now? They're going to migrate to where? To Egypt. Why are they going to be able to migrate to Egypt? Because Pharaoh was able to say to his man Joseph, "Look, I'll make you second in command of my whole kingdom. No one will do anything other than what I command, other than what you command. You are a powerful man." As a matter of fact, I think I have a picture there also of the fact that he is riding in the chariot. All of a sudden, we find Joseph in a very interesting position. He's one of the rulers in Egypt. Does it seem feasible? No, it isn't. Unless what? Unless that Pharaoh that we're reading about that had the dreams was not an Egyptian. What if he were not an Egyptian? What if he were something else? Remember my talking last week about people that were not Egyptians that were in control of part of Egypt? Remember we talked about the Hyksos. Last week we talked about the fact that when we did manage through the translation of the hieroglyphics, the history of Egypt, there are 33 very interesting dynasties that ruled in Egypt at one time, but one or two of them were particularly interesting. Around 1500, around 15th and 17th dynasties, we're told they were not ruled by Egyptians, they were ruled by the Hyksos. Who were these Hyksos? We talked a little bit about that last week. The Hyksos we're told were not Egyptians, but where did they come from? They wouldn't have come from the east, because that was the Great Sahara Desert. There wasn't anybody there. They would not have come from the south, because the south was what? That was the Egyptians. The Egyptians would send foreign ministers. They couldn't come very far from the east, because then you'd run into the Red Sea and everything else. Could they come from the north? If they came all the way from the north, they'd have to cross the Mediterranean Sea. And that's very unlikely. But if they went a little bit east and then went north, they would go to northeast. And guess what they would find in the northeast? Canaan. And what did we find last week? And that is that there was a mass migration of these Semitic people in Mesopotamia that had migrated where? Into Canaan. They had migrated into Canaan. I mentioned last week the people in Mesopotamia didn't talk about the loss of all the immigrants, of all the people that emigrated from their land. But what about the people in Egypt? The people in Egypt eventually did have to admit it, that very likely it was the Hyksos, were people that had come from Canaan and had made themselves the power in the delta part of Egypt. Now, how could that have been? I don't have the map right now, but let me just refresh your memory. If you take a look at the map, you'd find out that Canaan is almost where? Well, it's almost right on the shoreline with the delta. As a matter of fact, the only thing between the delta, which is a very fertile part of Egypt, that's where the Nile River flows into the Mediterranean, that very fertile part, where there was a lot of commerce. And apparently, as time went by, the Semitic people that had moved into Canaan started to live like the Canaanites, and it wasn't long before they were infiltrating themselves into the delta and got enough business going on in the delta that there were enough of these Canaanites there that they actually were able to set themselves up as their own government. And so they set themselves up as their own government. Now, when you stop to think about Joseph suddenly becoming the second in command of that whole region, it's not quite so strange, because what was true about the Pharaoh that appointed Joseph to this position, he was Semitic, just like Joseph was. There was nothing really strange about seeing Joseph there as a Semite, because there were a lot of other Semitic people, and the region itself was being controlled by a Semitic ruler. This Pharaoh, they call him Pharaoh, he's not a Pharaoh in the same sense as the Egyptian pharaohs. He's Pharaoh simply, that's what they call a king at that time. So what we find is that this interpretation or this situation that we have with Joseph suddenly being elevated to the position that we find him in is not too surprising. Can you figure out what's going to happen in the next part of the story? The next part of the story is going to be how the rest of the Israelites came from Canaan and came into Egypt. Because when we get to Exodus, what are we going to learn? We're going to learn that the Israelites were in Egypt, and the story of Exodus starts with the Israelites in Egypt and a matter of getting them back into Canaan. But we'll get to that a little bit later. But let's take a look at the situation that we have here in the story as we read it in Genesis. The strange dreams. I can imagine that Pharaoh was quite disturbed by watching fat cows being consumed by lean cows, or fat stalks of grain being consumed by lean stalks of grain. And Joseph has the interpretation, which the Bible says came from the Lord, namely that there would be, 7 years of plenty. There would be 7 years where the crops would grow, where things would prosper. And it would be necessary during those 7 years to prepare for the 7 years that followed, which would be 7 years of famine. And then it would be very important that during those good years, there would be supplies that were put away so that they could sustain themselves during the poor years. Well, that looks like quite a job to say the very least. And I think if you read that carefully, Pharaoh gave it some thought. We're going to have to find the right person to be in charge of that. That's who does he choose? Well, the man that gave them interpretation. He said, if the Lord can, or if you can give me an interpretation that is that closely to what might actually happen, why don't I appoint you as that man? And that's how Joseph found himself all of a sudden being in this very interesting situation. I'll go one little bit further here. I read verse 44. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man shall lift up his hand or foot in the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zephaniah, and gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, of the Potiphar priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. I just want to include that next slide today because it's kind of an interesting one. Here we see Joseph being introduced to this woman. Her name is Asenath. And she was the daughter of Well, actually, what is happening, in a sense, in the Egyptian custom, Egyptian hierarchy at that time, the priests were very important. And all of a sudden, Joseph not only is in a position where he has some power because of the governing, but he also becomes a what? A part of the royal family. He's married into the royal family. And he marries this woman. I had to look up the name, Asenath, A-S, then E-N-A-T-H. How do you pronounce that? Is that the end of her? Does anybody know what comes a little bit later, near the end of this chapter? What comes near the end of this chapter is that Joseph and this Asenath have 2 children. And who are they? Ephraim and what? Manasseh. 2 of the important tribes of Israel came from Joseph's marriage to this woman. And so she becomes very important in being a part of that history. Now, the next part of the history is a little bit different because it gets us into something that I think we could almost anticipate, and that is if there's going to be a famine, we're going to expect something to happen, namely that back in Canaan they might also be suffering from the famine, and if they wanted any food at all, where are they going to get it? They're going to have to go to Egypt. And how are they going to get to Egypt? Well, we'll read as we go on a little bit further. Jacob decides to send his sons to Egypt to go get this food so they won't starve to death. It seems like a rather reasonable thing to do. Now, we have read the Bible. The brothers have not. What do they know about their brother Joseph other than the fact that they had sold him into slavery and that they don't know where he went? They sold him to either the Ishmaelites or the Midianites, we don't know which, but he was sold into slavery. They lied to their father, made their father believe that Joseph was dead and had been devoured by some beast. But we know what? We have read the Bible, we have read these chapters, and we know that Joseph is still alive. He is in Egypt, and not only is he in Egypt, but he's in a position of very high power in the Egyptian government, in the government at that time. If these brothers are going to go to Egypt to try to get food, what is there the possibility of happening? They're going to run into Joseph. Now, I said this many times in teaching this class. You may read ahead. But what I find so fascinating about this whole story is that there could be a very interesting confrontation. But what happens is that the Bible writer, the history writer, puts us into a very interesting situation of a psychological war. Joseph has his revenge, you might say, has vengeance on his brother. But how he does it is so very interesting, and we'll look into that next week. I'll by that time get a voice back again.